I never thought I'd end up sharing this story with anyone, let alone strangers on the internet. But every time I try to sleep, I hear it. The faint sound of soil being disturbed, the whisper of something moving beneath the ground. It's been almost 12 years since that night, but the cemetery hasn't left me. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the only exciting thing for teenagers to do was drive out to the old Willow Creek Cemetery and try to scare ourselves. The place had been there since the 1800s, surrounded by rusted iron gates and leaning gravestones that looked ready to collapse. Half the graves didn't even have names anymore, just weathered stone half swallowed by moss. Local kids told stories, of course. There was the woman in white who supposedly wandered near the willow tree at midnight. There was the whistler, a man who died in the mines and was buried without a tongue, who could still whistle his mournful tune in the dark. I never believed any of it. Ghost stories were just background noise in a boring town. But the thing that drew us there wasn't the ghosts. It was the crypt. At the far end of Willow Creek, past the newer graves and into the older forgotten section, stood a stone mausoleum. The door had long since been chained shut, and a rusted padlock hung like a warning. Nobody in town seemed to know who the crypt belonged to. Some said it was for an old family that died out after the Civil War. Others said it had been condemned because grave robbers had broken in, and what they found was too disturbing to talk about. Naturally, that meant we had to see inside. I was 17 the night it happened. My best friend Mark was the ringleader. He always had a way of daring people into doing things they'd regret. With him was his girlfriend Sarah, my cousin Jake, and me. We drove out to the cemetery just after midnight, parked under the half-dead willow, and made our way to the crypt. The air was heavy, the kind of sticky, humid summer night where the cicadas sound like they're screaming. Mark had brought bolt cutters. "Come on," he whispered, grinning as he pressed them against the lock. "Don't you want to be the first people in town to see what's inside?" The cutters snapped through the rusted metal with surprising ease. The lock clattered to the ground, and the sound seemed to echo far too loudly across the graveyard. My chest tightened, but Mark was already pulling the chain free and pushing the stone door open. It groaned like something alive, exhaling a puff of stale, bitter air that reeked of earth and rot. Inside was blackness. We shone our flashlights around, beams slicing through thick cobwebs and dust. The crypt was small, maybe the size of a bedroom, lined with shelves where stone coffins rested. Some had lids cracked open, others were sealed shut. "Holy crap," Sarah whispered, covering her nose. "This is disgusting." Jake laughed nervously. "You wanted scary, this is scary. This is..." But Mark wasn't satisfied with just looking. He wanted more. His flashlight stopped on one coffin different from the rest. It wasn't stone. It was wood, rotting and split down the middle. A nameplate hung crookedly, but the letters were impossible to read. "That one," he said. "Help me get the lid off." I shook my head immediately. "No way, dude. That's grave desecration. We're already trespassing. This is enough." But Mark smirked, like he always did when someone told him no. "Don't be a coward. We came out here for this. You want to go home and tell everyone we chickened out?" He put his hands on the lid and started pushing. The wood creaked. Jake hesitated, then sighed and joined him. I stood frozen, my light shaking as it followed their movements. Sarah muttered curses under her breath but didn't stop them. And then, with a sharp crack, the coffin lid split open. The smell hit us first. Sweet, cloying, nauseating. Not fresh death, but something old, something that had been waiting a long time. My stomach lurched and Sarah gagged. Inside wasn't what I expected. There wasn't a skeleton like you'd see in movies. There was flesh. Dried, blackened, mummified flesh clinging to bones. The skin looked tight, stretched, but disturbingly intact for how old it had to be. But the worst part, the part I'll never forget, was the face. The eyes were gone, just hollow pits, but the mouth was open wide, as if frozen mid-scream. And in its bony fingers was something I didn't understand at first. A bundle, wrapped in rotting cloth. "Holy hell," Jake whispered. Is that a baby?" The bundle shifted. I swear to God, it moved. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight beam wavered as I tried to convince myself I imagined it. But Mark leaned closer, his face twisted with a mixture of fascination and horror. And then, clear as day, we heard it. A whimper, a baby's cry, coming from the bundle in the corpse's hands. Sarah screamed, bolting for the door. Jake followed, cursing and fumbling with his flashlight. Mark and I stayed frozen, staring into that coffin as the sound grew louder. It wasn't just a cry anymore. It was wailing, raw, desperate. My chest went cold, like all the air had been sucked out of me. Finally, instinct took over, and I grabbed Mark's arm, yanking him away. "We need to get the hell out of here." He resisted for a second, still staring down like he was hypnotized. Then the bundle twitched violently, and something tore through the cloth, something pale, slick, and clawed. We ran. I don't even remember how we got out. I just remember the sound chasing us. Tiny fingernails scratching wood, the wailing morphing into something sharper, something not human. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Sarah was already inside, sobbing. Jake was fumbling with the keys. We peeled out of the cemetery like the devil himself was behind us. That night should have ended there, but it didn't, because when I got home I found soil under my fingernails. Thick, dark soil, and I hadn't touched the ground. The next week, Mark stopped showing up to school. His mom said he wasn't feeling well. Then, a few days later, he was gone. Just gone. Police searched the woods, the rivers, the whole town. They found his shoes by the cemetery gates. Nothing else. Jake swore he saw something in his backyard one night, a small figure, crouched near the trees, watching his house. A week later, his dog was found dead, throat torn open. Jake's family moved away not long after. Sarah doesn't talk about it. If I bring it up, she hangs up the phone. She lives 3 states away now, but sometimes she texts me in the middle of the night. "Do you hear it too? The crying? And me?" I hear it every night. Sometimes it's faint, just a whimper on the edge of sleep. Sometimes it's so close I swear it's coming from under my bed. But last night was the worst. I woke up to find dirt scattered across my bedroom floor. My closet door was open, and from the dark inside came the sound, wet, ragged breathing and the soft, unmistakable wail of a baby. And then I saw it, a small, pale hand curling around the closet door, the same hand that tore through the bundle in the coffin. I used to work the night shift as a groundskeeper at a cemetery in upstate New York. I was 22, broke and desperate for work. The cemetery was called Riverside Memorial Park, though everyone in town still referred to it by its old name, St. Mary's Rest. It stretched across nearly 50 acres, filled with row after row of headstones, mausoleums, and family plots. Most of the job was boring, cutting grass, trimming hedges, keeping the place clean. But the real reason they needed night guards wasn't vandals or teenagers sneaking in. It was something else, something they didn't tell me about when I signed the papers. The first night, the older groundskeeper, Frank, handed me a flashlight, a set of keys, and a map of the cemetery. His face was weathered, his eyes heavy like a man who hadn't slept in years. "Stay near the caretaker's shed after midnight," he told me, his voice flat and tired. "If you hear anything strange, don't go wandering. You got that?" I laughed nervously, thinking he was just trying to scare the new guy. "What do you mean by strange?" Frank didn't laugh back. He just stared at me a moment, then said, "You'll know." That first week was uneventful. I'd do my rounds, smoke a couple cigarettes by the gate, and sit in the shed with my phone until sunrise. The cemetery at night wasn't as scary as I thought it'd be. It was quiet, almost peaceful. The moonlight spilled across the marble stones and the owls kept watch from the trees. But on my 6th night, something changed. Around 2 in the morning I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, drifting through the still air like a whisper. I thought maybe it was a fox or a raccoon, but as I stepped out of the shed, I realized it was singing. A woman's voice, soft, mournful, humming a lullaby. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The song was coming from the north end of the cemetery, the oldest section where the headstones were cracked and tilted like broken teeth. Against my better judgment, I followed it. Each step I took, the air grew colder, though it was summer and I could see my breath. Finally, I reached the source. A figure stood near a grave, a tall woman in a long, faded dress, her hair black and tangled, her face hidden in shadow. She swayed back and forth, humming to the ground as though trying to soothe something beneath it. I wanted to run. My legs screamed at me to turn and bolt back to the shed. But I couldn't. Something about the song pulled me closer, like a hook in my chest. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice shaking. The humming stopped. Slowly, her head turned toward me. The moonlight revealed her face, and it wasn't a face at all. It was a skull. Hollow socket stared back at me, teeth bared in a grin too wide, too human, yet somehow still alive. The empty socket seemed to see me, to know me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. By the time I scrambled to pick it up and shined it at the grave, she was gone. But the dirt on the grave was freshly disturbed, as if something had just been buried there. The next morning, I tried to tell Frank what I'd seen. He just sighed, shaking his head. "You shouldn't have gone to the north end," he muttered. "Didn't I tell you to stay near the shed?" I demanded answers, but he only said, "Some graves don't like to be visited, and some of them aren't empty." For weeks I tried to ignore it, but the humming came back, night after night, always at 2 a.m, always from a different grave. Sometimes I saw her standing there, sometimes just heard her voice. And every time, the ground around that grave would look freshly disturbed by sunrise. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to dig. One night, when the singing stopped, I brought a shovel to one of the graves she had visited. It was an old stone, weather-worn and half sunken into the ground, the name illegible. The soil was soft, as if someone had recently turned it. I dug until my hands blistered. The earth gave way too easily, as though it wanted to be opened. And then, my shovel struck wood. A coffin. But it wasn't closed. The lid was already broken, splintered like something had forced its way out. Inside wasn't a body, at least not a whole one. Just scraps of cloth, fragments of bone, and fingernail marks clawed into the wood from the inside. That's when I realized. The graves weren't being filled. They were being emptied. The woman wasn't mourning. She was calling them out. I staggered back, heart pounding, and nearly dropped my flashlight again. Because standing at the edge of the grave just a few feet away was Frank. Only it wasn't Frank. Not really. His face was pale, hollow, his eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in years, maybe decades. His smile stretched too wide, almost splitting his cheeks. "You shouldn't have dug," he whispered. His voice was deeper now, rasping, wet. "Once you disturb them, they never leave you alone." I blinked, and he was gone. The next day, Frank didn't show up to work. The cemetery manager said he quit, no notice, but his uniform and keys were still hanging in the shed. Now, I'm the only one on the night shift. The humming hasn't stopped. If anything, it's getting louder, closer. Sometimes it's right outside the shed door. Sometimes I wake up at home and hear it through my walls, faint, as though she's standing in my backyard. And just last night, when I went to check the shed before leaving, there was dirt on the floor, piles of it as if someone had been digging inside, and carved into the wooden wall was a message, written in long, deep scratches. "Next grave is yours." When I was a kid, my grandmother used to warn me never to play near the old Greenfield cemetery at the edge of town. It wasn't just because it was dangerous, with crumbling tombstones and broken fences. It was because, as she always said in her hushed, trembling voice, some graves don't stay where they're put. I thought it was just one of those eerie sayings old people use to scare kids into behaving. I didn't believe her, until the night I found out exactly what she meant. I was 25 when it happened. I'd just moved back into my hometown in Ohio after a messy breakup, trying to get back on my feet. Money was tight, so I ended up renting a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town, the cheapest one I could find. The problem? It was just a short walk from Greenfield Cemetery. The place had been abandoned for years. The gates were rusted shut, weeds taller than me choked the paths, and many of the headstones had toppled or cracked open. No one buried their dead there anymore. It was too old, too forgotten. Still, I always felt like the air around it was heavier, as though the earth itself held on to something it didn't want to let go of. At first, I avoided it, but after a couple weeks of living there, curiosity got the better of me. I figured a late-night walk through the cemetery might help clear my head. That night, the sky was overcast, the moon a dull smear behind thick clouds. I slipped through a gap in the fence and stepped into the sea of crooked stones. The air was damp and smelled of moss and soil. Crickets chirped somewhere in the distance, but everything else was deathly still. I walked for a while, shining my flashlight over names worn down by time. Some graves had no names at all, just slabs of stone. Eventually, I came across one that stood out. It was newer than the others, though still decades old. A black marble headstone, polished and gleaming despite the decay around it. The inscription was carved deep, as though someone wanted to make sure it lasted forever. Here lies Daniel Crow, 1912-1936. He shall not rest. I frowned at the epitaph. He shall not rest. That wasn't normal. Gravestones usually said things like, rest in peace, or beloved husband. This one felt like a warning. The ground around the grave looked freshly turned, though that was impossible. No one had been buried there in over half a century. I remember shivering, though the air wasn't cold. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint tapping, almost like fingers drumming from beneath the soil. But when I crouched down to listen closer, the sound stopped. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I pressed my hand against the gravestone. It was warm. That night, I woke up to scratching sounds in my bedroom. My first thought was mice or raccoons. I switched on the light, but the noise stopped. When I checked, there was nothing there. Still, the sound had been so distinct, like fingernails dragging across wood. The next morning, I noticed dirt on my bedroom floor, dark, damp soil, scattered in a trail from the door to the side of my bed. My shoes were clean, my windows locked. I told myself it was just some mess I hadn't noticed before. But then it happened again. Each night, the scratching grew louder. Each morning, more soil appeared, across my floor, on my sheets, even under my fingernails, though I hadn't been outside. One night, I woke up gasping, convinced something was pressing down on my chest. The room was pitch black and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow crouched in the corner, long arms stretching toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The shadow was gone, and I was left drenched in sweat, lungs aching. Desperate for answers, I went to the library the next day and dug into the cemetery's history. That's when I learned about Daniel Crow. He had been a young man accused of murdering a child in town back in the 1930s. There wasn't enough evidence to convict him, but the townspeople believed he was guilty. A mob dragged him from his home and hanged him just outside the cemetery gates. Out of fear and rage, they buried him there, not as an honored soul, but as a warning. They carved, "He shall not rest," into his stone, a curse to keep his spirit awake, restless, forever. And now I had touched his grave. That night, the scratching didn't just stay in the walls or under the floorboards. It was right beside me. I felt my mattress shift, as though someone heavy had sat down next to me. I forced myself to turn my head, and there he was. A man, or what used to be a man. His face was gaunt, stretched, eyes hollow sockets that glowed faintly with something inhuman. Rope burns ringed his neck, raw and blackened. Dirt clung to his clothes, falling onto my bed in clumps. "Why did you wake me?" he rasped. I couldn't answer. My throat was too dry, my heart beating so violently I thought it would burst. He leaned closer, and the stench of damp earth and rot filled my lungs. "You touched my grave. Now you carry me with you." I bolted upright, gasping, and suddenly the bed was empty. No man, no dirt, nothing. Just silence. I told myself it was a dream, some twisted nightmare brought on by stress. But the soil kept appearing. Over the next few weeks, it spread beyond my bedroom. I'd find clumps of it in my kitchen sink, in the shower drain, even inside the fridge. No matter how much I cleaned, it came back, fresh and wet, like it had just been dug from the earth. Worse, the shadow followed me. I'd see it at work in the corner of my eye, crouched near the filing cabinets. On the bus, I'd catch its reflection in the window, sitting right behind me. One night I fled my house entirely, convinced I could escape it. I drove to my sister's place 2 towns over, arriving at nearly 3 in the morning. She thought I was drunk, paranoid. I begged her to let me stay the night. When I woke up the next morning, she was pale, trembling, pointing at the floor. There was dirt all over her living room carpet. She kicked me out that day. I tried hotels, motels, even sleeping in my car. It didn't matter. Wherever I went, the soil followed. So did he. The last time I saw him was a week ago. I was standing in the bathroom brushing my teeth, trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. And then, in the mirror, I saw him standing directly behind me. His mouth stretched into an impossible grin, dirt spilling from between his teeth. His voice was a whisper in my ear, but his lips in the reflection didn't move. "You can't run. You carry my grave with you now." The lights flickered, and for just a moment I swore the walls of the bathroom weren't drywall anymore. They were stone, damp and moss-covered, like the inside of a crypt. And the floor beneath me wasn't tile. It was soil. I blinked, and it was gone. But I know it won't stay gone. Because each night, I hear the scratching again, louder, closer. Sometimes it feels like it's coming from inside me, like he's not just following me anymore. He's becoming me. And tonight, as I sit here writing this, there's dirt under my fingernails again. Only this time, I haven't touched the ground at all. I never wanted to work nights at the funeral home. But when you're broke, drowning in debt and struggling to keep your head above water, you take whatever job comes your way. The place was called Hollow Pines Funeral Home Cemetery, a family-owned business on the outskirts of Kentucky. My job was simple: keep watch at night, answer phone calls, and make sure no one trespassed in the cemetery after dark. At first, it sounded easy enough. The funeral home itself was small and quiet, with a chapel, a viewing room, and a prep room in the basement where bodies were embalmed. The cemetery stretched behind it for acres, rows of white headstones, tall pines whispering in the wind, and a crypt that sat like a forgotten relic at the far end of the property. The manager, Mr. Holloway, was a stiff, gray-haired man who barely looked me in the eyes. On my first day, he gave me the tour, walking me past the graves with his flashlight beam cutting through the dusk. "There are rules you'll need to follow," he said flatly. "Never leave the chapel lights off after midnight. Don't answer the phone if it rings between 2 and 3. And if you hear anything coming from the crypt, don't investigate." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of hazing ritual, but his face never cracked a smile. "You understand?" he asked again, his voice sharper this time. I nodded, though a knot tightened in my stomach. For the first couple of weeks, nothing happened. I sat behind the desk at night drinking coffee, scrolling through my phone, sometimes watching late-night TV on the old box set in the lounge. The phone would ring occasionally, but always before midnight. The lights stayed on. The crypt stayed silent. But then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered the roof, and thunder rattled the windows. Around midnight, I was checking the viewing room when the power flickered, plunging everything into darkness for a split second before the backup generator kicked in. The chapel lights sputtered back on, weak and buzzing. That's when I heard it. A faint ringing. The phone. I glanced at the clock. 2:12 a.m. My stomach dropped. Holloway's warning echoed in my head. Don't answer the phone if it rings between 2 and 3. But the sound wouldn't stop. Shrill, insistent, drilling into my ears. Against every instinct, I picked it up. Hello? Static hissed on the other end. For a moment, I thought the storm had messed with the line. Then, through the crackle, a voice emerged. Faint, raspy, childlike. Don't let them out. The line went dead. I stood frozen, heart pounding. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the receiver. I tried convincing myself it was a prank, maybe some kid who knew about the funeral home's creepy reputation. But then I noticed something. The chapel lights were flickering again. I turned slowly, and my stomach turned to ice. Every single coffin in the viewing room, 3 of them, lined neatly for upcoming funerals, had their lids open. Empty. The storm outside roared, but inside the silence was suffocating. I felt eyes on me, dozens of them, though the room looked empty. My flashlight beam shook as I swept it across the polished wood caskets, the floral arrangements, the velvet curtains. Nothing. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not outside. Inside. Coming from the basement. I wanted to run, but my legs carried me forward instead. Down the creaking stairs into the prep room, where the air was damp and metallic with the smell of chemicals. That's when I saw the gurney. The sheet covering the body was half pulled back, and beneath it the skin wasn't pale and still. It was gray, mottled, twitching. Fingers curled and uncurled slowly, like they were testing their strength. I stumbled back, clamping my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My flashlight flickered, and when it steadied again, the body was gone. The door to the crypt slammed upstairs. I bolted back up, nearly tripping over my own feet. The front doors were locked, but the air was different now. Thicker, colder, as if the entire funeral home was holding its breath. I told myself I wouldn't go near the crypt. Holloway's warning repeated in my head. Don't investigate. But the sound drew me closer anyway. Whispering. Dozens of voices, low and layered, echoing from the crypt's stone walls. I pressed my ear to the cold door, and for a moment, I could make out the words. Let us out. Let us out. Something inside pressed against the door, hard enough to make the chains rattle. I ran back to the office, locked myself in, and waited for dawn. The whispers faded just before sunrise. When Holloway arrived that morning, I confronted him, my voice shaking as I demanded answers. He stared at me for a long time, then finally spoke. The crypt doesn't hold the dead, he said quietly. It holds the ones who refuse to stay dead. That's why the lights must stay on, to keep them weak. That's why the phone mustn't be answered, because they call when they're strongest. And that's why you never, ever open the crypt. Because if you do... He trailed off, his eyes shifting to the chapel. I followed his gaze. The coffins that had been empty the night before were closed again, perfectly sealed, as though they'd never been disturbed. Go home, Holloway said finally, and don't come back tonight. I quit that day. I didn't even collect my final paycheck. But here's the thing. Leaving didn't help. The phone at my apartment rang last night. 2:17 a.m. I didn't answer, but when I picked it up this morning to call my mom, there was dirt packed into the receiver. Fresh, damp soil. And just now, as I write this, my lights are flickering, and I can hear whispering through the walls.